I want to let everyone know that after the talk, we have a reception over in the Fine Arts Gallery. So there's food and some beverages, and we want to invite all of you to come and continue the conversation over there. Can I also ask everyone to be sure your phones are silenced as we listen to the talk today? I am the department chair for the Department of Literatures and Languages. And when we thought about what events we wanted to be able to offer as part of the RITA 10th anniversary celebration, I really wanted us to be able to let the community and our students see a side of their professors that sometimes we don't get to see. So you see your professors in the classroom, lecturing and leading discussions, but there's this whole world of the mind that kind of goes on kind of quietly, and these books that we write and publish. And so I hope that today you get a little glimpse into that world. I also asked both Joe and Doug if they had a student that might be a good choice to introduce them, and they gave me the same name. So without further ado, I'm going to let Byron Dowse do a more formal introduction.
It's going to be a great evening. I've had both of these professors, and they're both outstanding. And my praise is very judicious, so you can take that to the bank. Josef Benson is an associate professor in the Literature and Languages department here at UW-Parkside. He offers courses in contemporary literature, African American literature, fiction writing, and composition. He is the author of 3 books. 1, Star Wars, The Triumph of Nerd Culture. Number 2, J.D. Salinger's The Catcher in the Rye, A Cultural History. And 3rd, Hyper-Masculinities in the Contemporary Novel, with pieces on Cormac McCarthy, Toni Morrison, and James Baldwin. I can speak from personal experience. I used this as a reference in one of my papers. It is an outstanding book. Additionally, his work has appeared in over 20 publications, including Modern Fiction Studies, the Journal of Medical Humanities, and Southwestern American Literature. He holds creative writing degrees from Missouri State University and the University of South Florida. Also a PhD in literature with a heavy emphasis in gender theory, also from the University of South Florida. He is currently working on 2 additional books. The first is A Culture of Violence, Jeffrey Dahmer, Serial Killing, and America's History of Racial Violence. And the second is An Introduction to the American Short Story for Routledge Press. Our second distinguished speaker tonight is Associate Professor Doug Singsen, who got his PhD in art history at the City University of New York. He teaches classes in the history of art, design, and visual culture, including courses on comics and graphic novels. He has written entries for the Grove Encyclopedia of American Art and Key Terms in Comic Studies, as well as peer-reviewed articles for the Journal of Graphic Novels and Comics and Modernism/Modernity. He is currently working on a new art history survey textbook for Oxford University Press called Art, A Global History, where he is leading a team of 3 authors. He is also the director of general education here at Parkside and a board member of Vocus de la Frontera, translated Voices of the Border, a leading immigrant rights advocacy group here in Wisconsin. Once again, I am just deeply honored that both of them asked me to introduce them. And again, I highly recommend to you, students here, that you take their classes. You will be forever grateful for the knowledge that they bring to the table. And tonight is a great opportunity for all of us to learn once again from them. Please welcome these wonderful and fantastic academic professors that we are so fortunate to have here at Parkside.
Thank you. That was very kind. Thank you. Welcome, everybody. And thank you, Byron, for that. It was great. We're going to kind of mirror our process, Doug and I, so we're just going to argue for about an hour. No, I'm kidding. I want to talk a little bit about how the project originated first, and I'm sure Doug will chime in as well, and then I'll get into an excerpt of the introduction just to give you a good sense of the framework. I want to take some time and really get into that, and then we're going to get into the chapters and some of the images that will be on the screen there, and then I'll touch on some of our findings, our conclusions. So the project actually started long before I sort of start this timeline, but it was sort of unbeknownst to me at the time. I was not a huge comics reader when I was a kid. I read Archie comics and some, I remember reading like Beetle Bailey when I was a kid, but I wasn't a huge comics aficionado. I was very much into literature, kind of snobby about what I considered literature. And then after graduate school, I started to get interested in other kinds of literatures. I guess I got less snobby, I don't know. But I read the graphic novel Watchmen, and that really gave me the idea at that time that, wow, comics, I guess I was sort of late to the party, but I was like, comics, would be a fantastic way to make some of these arguments that I had been writing primarily about traditional literature. And much of my dissertation dealt with masculinity studies, and very little of it had to do with whiteness. But right when I read Watchmen, I realized, wow, here's an opportunity to write something. And this was in, I think, 2012. Fast forward a couple years when I started teaching here, I still had that idea that I wanted to write about Watchmen. I didn't know there was going to be a book. I just thought, I want to write maybe an article about the graphic novel Watchmen. So I created a conference paper, and lo and behold, a acquisition editor from University of Mississippi Press, which is the foremost publisher for comic scholarship, saw my presentation and asked me if I wanted to write a book. And the answer to that is always yes, even if you're totally not prepared, which I was not. I didn't know that. And so I thought, okay, I'm gonna do this. I've read probably 6 comics in my entire life, but anybody who knows me knows I'm not really afraid of a challenge. So around this time, a couple professors were meeting for a drink in Milwaukee in Bayview, and I think we were all meeting at the Bubbler, which is this little hole in the wall. And there was a professor there who was new to Parkside. I'd never met him before, and it was Doug. And he happened to sit right next to me. And, I'm a terrible braggart. And so I was talking about this book deal that I was going to get. And I had no idea that Doug had written his dissertation about comics, right? Doug still knows far more than I do about comics. But I started telling him about this book I wanted to write about comics. And Doug looked at me, he's like, "You don't know shit about comics, do you?" And I was like, "Yeah, well, not really. And he was like, "Well, I wrote my dissertation on comics." And I was like, "Oh, wow." And so I said, I'm going to send you this presentation that I did. It was very short. It's probably 8, 9 pages. And I didn't have much of a proposal at the time at all. So I sent it to Doug, and he got back to me, and he said, we should do this together. I think that would make a lot of sense. Being an art historian, what he was bringing to the table with respect to comics, and comics is so reliant on the image, whereas I was simply reading it like typical literature. That's kind of how that came about. But like I said, when I began, the book started well before that because Doug had been studying comics for years. So maybe Doug, if you want to chime in about how you got into comics.
Yeah, sure. I mean, so my interest in comics started in adolescence at summer camp. And there were a number of odd things about the way I got into it. So some of my friends at summer camp were comics fans, and they were very excited about this new company called Valiant Comics that I didn't know at the time, but had been founded by a guy who got fired, been the editor-in-chief at Marvel, and been fired for just kind of being a jerk. A jerk with a lot of ideas, and he couldn't do them all at Marvel, so there was a falling out, he left. And they started just like narrating to me the story of this comic book universe. So my introduction to comics was actually like oral storytelling, weirdly. And so, I sort of read these kind of like superhero comics for a few years, and then I discovered alternative comics, which are not superheroes. They're more sort of like the literary subculture of the comic subculture. And, so I found lots of things I was interested in, actually including Watchmen, which sort of straddles superheroes and alternative comics, and still one of my favorites. And yeah, so I definitely became, not like a hardcore comics fan. I sort of lurked in the world of comics fandom. And, ended up, I studied painting as an undergraduate, sort of switched to art history, went back to grad school for art history, and so sort of made a kind of lateral career move. Had no thought of writing about comics until a professor that I was very fond of recommended, found out that I was interested in comics, and she thought this was a really interesting sort of emerging academic subfield. This was like 20 years ago, 15 years ago. And recommended that, I think about whether I was interested in writing about doing research and writing about that, because it just seemed like really fertile ground for research. And, which is, that's what like a good academic advisor should be doing. She had that was a much better idea than the direction I was going in at the time, which was kind of continuing to rehash old debates. And I kind of pretty quickly realized, yeah, okay, it's a lot more interesting to be thinking about sort of how to frame a field rather than going over ground that other people have already done. So that kind of led me to thinking about to reading the academic literature, and I ended up writing a dissertation on the borderlands actually between alternative comics and mainstream comics. And then, jump forward a few years. I finished my dissertation, get hired at Parkside, moved to Milwaukee, encountered Joe in the bar. I don't think I was actually as blunt. I don't think I actually was as blunt as you said, although that is what I was thinking. So I'm not so great at hiding my thoughts.
I read like a book.
Yeah, but I mean, it was clear to me that this was like a good idea. This was a topic, you know, the topic was like whiteness, a critical study of whiteness in American comics and graphic novels. I knew some research that dealt with that, but I also knew that no one had really tried to look at the field, that topic as a whole, and see how all the different pieces fit together. It seemed very intellectually interesting to me, as well as something that was kind of like just ethically, politically necessary, like this book needed to be written. And although it was clear Joe did not have like a ton of knowledge about comics history, he had a lot of knowledge about gender theory and ethnic studies, more than I did. I had some, but it seemed pretty clear. I mean, like from the, you know, as soon as he started describing what he was doing, I was thinking that, you know, this project really would make more, I mean, like the two of us as a team working on this would be a very good fit. We would complement each other, and I proposed that we do that, and I was kind of expecting to just get brushed aside, since it was his project, like why would he share such a good idea? But to my semi-surprise, he agreed to do it, and so that began 2 or 3 years of just incessant bickering, where I would say, I mean, you know, like, I mean, we never really disagreed on the substance of what we were trying to say, but the way that we went about, like, you know, writing drafts, developing ideas was like never on the same page. But I think in the end, it ended up working out very well, and we hopefully managed to keep the best of both of our approaches and get rid of the not-so-best parts.
Yeah, and I say I could do a whole talk just on collaboration alone, which is totally interesting and I think worth talking about. But, you know, Doug actually we went through a lot of versions of this cover, and Doug felt that this word right here, whiteness, should have been a little bit more somehow highlighted or underscored, because the book very much is about whiteness and how comics fit within that theoretical framework. So I want to take some time to read a little bit of the introduction to give you a sense of what we mean by whiteness. And don't call the police, but we're going to get into a little bit of critical race theory here. But whiteness pervades American culture, but many people, especially whites, are unaware or only fleetingly aware of its presence all around them. The simultaneous pervasiveness and invisibility of whiteness are often compared to the way that water surrounds a fish. Fish live their entire lives surrounded by water, never encountering any other environment. Their entire being has evolved to exist in water, so they're not even aware of its presence or its influence on their lives. Similarly, whiteness influences all areas of American life and culture, yet remains imperceptible to many Americans. Indeed, a large part of its power stems from its imperceptibility. Joe Fegan has argued that most white people carry with them and apply a set of racial assumptions, often without even being aware that they are doing so. A bundle of assumptions that he terms the white racial frame. These assumptions provide a justification for the advantages that whites enjoy in American society and for the mistreatment, oppression, and exploitation experienced by people of color. Whiteness has always connoted a sense of power and subjugation, a note of contradistinctive exceptionality, a raison d'etre for exploitation, enslavement, and murder. Political whiteness functions as a construct of normativity whereby those in power tacitly and sometimes unwittingly define themselves as raceless, monolithic, group inherently worthy of privilege and power, while others exist as inherently inferior. Because most people do not perceive the white frame, they are not even aware that they are employing it, and consequently are unable to recognize or counteract its effects. When it is pointed out, they often react dismissively or angrily, accusing the messenger of manufacturing charges of racism for political reasons. Robin DiAngelo describes these emotional and often hostile responses by whites toward anyone who broaches the white racial frame as white fragility. DiAngelo points out that white fragility stems from whites existing within an insulated, racially stress-free environment where they have not had to build the cognitive or affective skills or develop the stamina that would allow for constructive engagement across racial divides. Whiteness has a powerful impact on both how whites and people of color define their identities. In Playing in the Dark, Whiteness in the Literary Imagination, one of the seminal texts of whiteness studies, Toni Morrison writes that the construction of blackness is the vehicle by which the American self knows itself not as enslaved, but free, not repulsive but desirable, not helpless but licensed and powerful, not historyless but historical, not damned but innocent, not blind accident of evolution but a progressive fulfillment of destiny. Whiteness does not exist without non-whiteness and vice versa. They define each other. While the discipline of ethnic studies initially focused on recovering the lost or buried stories of people of color, it has become clear that to fully unpack and understand the construction of race, it is necessary to name and analyze whiteness as well as blackness and brownness. Thus, Morrison calls for scholars to avert the critical gaze from the racial object to the racial subject, from the described and imagined to the describers and imaginers, from the serving to the served. We share Morrison's goal of analyzing the impact of notions of racial hierarchy, racial exclusion, and racial vulnerability and availability on non-blacks, while also recognizing with her that whiteness and non-whiteness are always dialectically intertwined. In interrogating and mapping the construction of whiteness, therefore, we are also always interrogating and mapping the construction of other racial identities as well. In addition to defining itself against other racial identities, whiteness is also internally divided. White identity is normally constructed as a single monolithic identity, but this pretense of unity masks a reality of internal division and hierarchy. Most notably in the late 19th century and early 20th, recent immigrants to America from Southern and Eastern Europe were not considered fully white. Depending on the situation, they could be granted provisional or partial inclusion within the charmed circle of whiteness, but more commonly they were categorized as non-white and denied the benefits that came with this status. Yet at the same time, they always received preferential treatment compared to other groups that were even farther down the racial hierarchy, including African Americans, Mexicans, and other Hispanic groups, and Asians. The new immigrants from Southern and Eastern Europe were, in the whiteness scholar David Reitiger's description, in between hard racism and full inclusion, neither securely white nor non-white. This group included Jewish immigrants who played a disproportionately important role in comics history. Jewish writers and artists were responsible for the creation of Superman, Batman, Captain America, Iron Man, Spider-Man, the Hulk, X-Men, and many more of the most iconic characters in American comics. All these characters reveal the imprint of the Jewish experience, although usually in ways that are disguised or camouflaged. In particular, the Jewish experience of being both an insider and outsider, an experience that directly reflects the Jewish experience of being considered provisionally but not fully white, is a constant theme of superhero comics. The internal fragmentation of whiteness also appears in a myriad of other ways that we explore throughout the book. The goal of this book is to analyze, understand, and critique constructions of whiteness, that is, the racial and ethnic identities of white people. Individual whites absorb racist ideas from the institutions of American culture and from the behavior of people around them, but the system of white supremacy as a whole is the collective product of the American cultural landscape, not of any one individual. We are therefore not as concerned in this book with the question of whether individual comic writers, artists, editors, and publishers are racist. This is not because they were not racist. In many, and arguably most cases, they were. We're not as concerned with the question of individual culpability or guilt, because it is of limited use in helping us understand how white supremacy functions. What we are more interested in are the codes, tropes, and structures through which white supremacy expresses and reproduces itself in the medium of comic books. The individuals who created these comics did not have to be consciously aware of what they were doing. They absorbed the ideology of whiteness and white supremacy throughout their lives, and like the fish swimming in the water, were unaware or not fully aware of its existence and influence on them. Thus, many individuals who produced highly racist characters and stories did not consider themselves racist. They were unaware of how whiteness pervades American society and structured their reality, creating what Joe Fegan has called the white racial frame, through which they view the world without being aware of it. So that hopefully gives you a quick sense of what we mean when we talk about whiteness. So now I want to get into the chapters, and we're going to go basically through a couple, in a way, each chapter we sort of were the lead investigator, I guess I would call, with each chapter, but eventually we both collaborated on each one. So we're going to kind of go back and forth in some of the chapters wherein either of us were sort of the lead investigators. And the first chapter in the book is about the origin of superheroes. Doug led the way there.
Yeah, and we're not covering like every chapter in the book. We kind of selected what we thought was sort of a representative examples that would sort of show the overall narrative of the book. And so we're going to start with the origin of the superhero. And the American comic book industry really begins with one superhero in particular, Superman. There had been newspaper comics in the U.S. for decades before this, which were very popular. The comic book industry in the United States began when newspaper comics started being collected and sold in pamphlet form, essentially. But it wasn't until 1939, 37, 39, okay, I'm blanking on the date right now. It wasn't until the late 30s that original material started being created for comic books. And the character that essentially created this as its own industry rather than simply as like a kind of, side tangent from newspaper comics was the character of Superman. Superman was introduced, it was created and written and drawn by two Jewish kids from Cleveland, Jerry Siegel and Joe Shuster. They were very young at the time. I want to say they created him when they were like 15 or 16, and on the left is actually the first published work by them that used the word Superman, which was a self-published fanzine that they created in high school. They shopped it around to various publishers, but none of them were interested until National Comics, later known as Detective Comics, decided that this was worth pursuing and published it. And it very quickly became a massive sensation. Within a couple years, it was being published in comic book form as a newspaper comic. It had been adapted into a radio series and a film series. So it was a cross-media, sensation almost immediately. So really, if you're looking at the history of American comics, in a real sense, it begins with Superman. Now, okay, so how does this relate to whiteness? Well, that term Superman was not invented by Siegel and Shuster. The origin of that term goes back to the German philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche's concept of the Superman, or Übermensch, which probably a slightly better translation is Overman. And Nietzsche explained this concept in a book he wrote called Thus Spoke Zarathustra, which was published in the 1880s. And Nietzsche is an incredibly complex and problematic figure who I'm not going to attempt to summarize or unpack here. Suffice it to say that he was a staunch critic of Christianity and of nationalism, European nationalism, and of all forms of conventional morality. He was also, had distinct anti-Semitic tendencies, and was virulently anti-feminist and undoubtedly misogynistic. His ideas after he published, he died not that long after publishing Thus Spoke Zarathustra, and his ideas kind of went nowhere for a little while, and then they went everywhere. And they got picked up by all kinds of people, including, for instance, ultimately the Nazis sort of made him their, one of their primary philosophical, influences. Cited him, especially for, they felt that his views of the Jewish people aligned with their own, as well as of women. Nietzsche has less to say about other racial groups outside of Europe, but in general, they just read him as being totally in line with their views. However, Nietzsche was also an influence on a whole group of, for instance, socialists, including the science fiction writer H.G. Wells, and many others. I mean, he helped seed the intellectual groundwork for existentialism, which was, antagonistic to Nazism, et cetera. So Nietzsche is incredibly complicated, but by the early 1900s, this idea of the Superman as someone who is going to transcend the limitations of contemporary humanity was circulating all over the place and getting taken up by lots of different people who were just sort of reading whatever they wanted into it. I mean, in a lot of ways, Nietzsche is like a Rorschach test. And you see whatever, people project their value systems onto Nietzsche, I would say. And Nietzsche, I think, was intentionally inscrutable. So in any case, like this idea of the Superman was percolating in Europe and the United States. It was very influential on early science fiction, the idea of someone who would use technology to do impossible things that had never been done before. And that was the idea that Siegel and Schuster picked up. And in their version, the Superman was an evil genius who, he develops like a super intelligence serum that he takes that gives him the ability to sort of take over the world. But eventually, he somehow runs out of it and gets killed by one of his rivals. And so that's the story that you can see on the left there. And just for comparison, on the right is an almost exactly contemporary poster by a Nazi graphic designer and artist named Ludwig Hohlwein, which shows this is the Nazi conception of the Superman. I mean, as this figure, this stupendous figure who would do things radically different and better than anyone else. So Siegel and Schuster started out with the Superman as a villain. In a later version of this character, he became good. And also went from a mad scientist to an alien from the planet Krypton. And where this gets interesting in relation to Whiteness is that a lot of people have read the story of Superman as being a kind of metaphor for the Jewish experience in the United States. So Superman's home world is being destroyed. He has to flee it and crash lands on a foreign world where he goes, he hides his true identity as a Kryptonian and assimilates so fully into the society where he lands. He happens to land in Kansas, that he becomes, the ultimate symbol of America. And yet he also becomes an advocate of the underdog. And his power derives from the fact that he is not of the people who he is with, although no one is aware of this. So he has a secret identity. And many people have pointed out that this parallels in a lot of ways the experience of Jewish immigrants coming to the United States. Europe was, entering the period of World War I and II, anti-Semitism was on the rise, fascism was on the rise, and Jewish immigrants were escaping that before it sort of, almost literally kind of exploded, certainly exploded socially and politically. They come to the United States, and as Joe was saying before, they, like other immigrants from Eastern Europe and Southern Europe, are given this sort of provisionally white status, which means in some situations they were treated as though they were white, and in others as though they were not. And so it's possible for them to assimilate up to a point. And in fact, Superman was, in a lot of ways, it was Siegel and Schuster's way of assimilating into American society and the media, and they did it spectacularly successfully, creating one of the most iconic characters of American culture of the 20th century. And yet there is always, there are always the idea of the Superman also raises some kind of tricky questions for them in the way that they write the character, because he is an advocate and defender of the downtrodden, but he also is super powerful and is not, really accountable to anyone. He's a vigilante. And there's also, in America, the history of vigilantism is tied up in a lot of cases with, for instance, the Ku Klux Klan, which was a mass movement in the United States during exactly this time, targeted anyone who wasn't white and straight and Christian, including Jews as well as, most famously black people, but anyone who was not a sort of Northern European white person, very much including Jews. And yet, so this image of the glorious vigilante is kind of circulating in American society. It overlaps a lot with the idea of the Superman. So for instance, you had characters like Zorro. That was a major influence on Superman. And so, none of these ideas, these sort of ideas of like racial superiority ever get expressed directly in Superman, but they're all part of this kind of cultural subtext for it. And it's just very, I wouldn't say that Siegel and Schuster, they actually almost never had any derogatory racial stereotypes in their comics. There were other, we're gonna see in a second, there were other American cartoonists who had extremely racist characters in their comics, but Siegel and Schuster didn't. In fact, they had almost no characters who weren't white at all, which is itself a symptom of the white racial frame. It's just like other races were just invisible to them. And so this kind of begins the long, messy history of race in American comics, where, as I said, there are some examples of American comics that are just blatantly racist. There are some examples that I would say do a pretty good job of critiquing racism, but the vast majority of comics that we looked at, I would say, are generally, when they deal with race, which is not that often, they are trying to avoid being racist and failing because they have this, these unspoken, this sort of unexpressed white racial frame that they aren't even aware that they're carrying around with them. It's like they are fish in water, to use the metaphor that Joe mentioned earlier. And so they're trying to avoid reproducing, in some cases they're actually trying to actively fight racism, but while doing it being racist. And this panel sequence is kind of the perfect example of that, and it's extremely clear. It's from a story, it's from a series about a kind of super heroic detective called The Spirit, who has this extremely racist black sidekick named Ebony White, which that name itself is already a racial, it's not a dog whistle, it's like a bullhorn, although it's very unclear what it even means. But he is a straight racial caricature out of Jim Crow. Now, the creator of The Spirit, Will Eisner, was one of the many Jewish artists in New York City who were the backbone, really, of the comic industry and who invented Superman, Batman, Captain America, many others, all invented by Jewish creators, many of whom changed their name, by the way, much as Superman changed his name to Clark Kent from Kal-El, I guess, was his Kryptonian name. And Kal-El also is a very Hebrew-sounding name. Okay, so this is a story about the Spirit and Ebony finding out about a ring of like Nazi saboteurs in New York. This was a very common storyline during World War II. And so here, Ebony is overhearing a group of Nazi saboteurs making plans in a car. And he hears this and then is going to go back to the Spirit to report on what he's heard so that they can defeat them. But so it's meant to be a critique of the racist ideology of Nazism, but he is himself producing an absolutely horrendous racist caricature of a black person here. And so this is just the most sort of blatant, over-the-top, awful example. A lot of other examples are much murkier. It really runs the whole gamut. And actually, it was relatively rare to find, there were not a lot of depictions of black people at all in early American comics, which again is a symptom of the white racial frame itself. They're just sort of invisible. However, US comics in the 1940s were overflowing with horrific depictions of Asian Americans, particularly Japanese people, because Japan was the enemy in World War II, so it was sort of authorized to depict them in the most negative possible fashion because the US was trying to rally its citizens for the war effort. Germans also got depicted like this, but not nearly as badly. Germans, after all, were white. There was a significant German-American population in the United States, which didn't want to be lumped in with the Nazis. There was also a significant Japanese American population, but they did not have the political or social standing to push back on this. They were already marginalized within US society, so they were just easier targets. And they were targeted over and over and over again. So here, this is Daredevil, different Daredevil than the Marvel character, fighting his nemesis called the Claw, who is a sort of Japanese supervillain. And we could just produce dozens of images like this. So this is just completely overt racism. There were also slightly more disguised versions of racism, such as the Jungle Queen genre and Jungle King, although Queen was more popular. And so that's kind of an intersection of race and gender. The most popular of these characters was Sheena, Queen of the Jungle, who is literally a white savior who protects the lovable but childlike African natives from various threats, mostly other white people. Here, this is not, it is absolutely a racist caricature, and it's positioning the white hero as the protector of black people who are not intelligent or sophisticated enough to defend themselves. And this also establishes a pattern that continues in American comics. And it overlaps, and so on the one hand, white characters like Sheena are positioned as defenders of the childlike non-white peoples, especially black people, but not exclusively. Another running theme in early American comics is the need for white heroes to defeat misguided rebels in other countries, especially black and brown countries. Latin America was the focus here, so there's many, many stories where Captain America or Green Lantern or some other superhero goes into a Latin American country that is having some kind of rebellion or revolution. And during this period, a lot of Latin American countries were trying to free themselves from American imperialism. There were many revolutionary movements that were trying to, for instance, seize back land that had been appropriated by corrupt American conglomerates, most famously fruit companies in different parts of Latin America. And the American superhero would go in, would show that these rebels were, they weren't really trying to help their people, they were corrupt, and they were the agents of some evil supervillain who the white hero would defeat. And this also is a theme that we're going to see gets repeated. And so there's a whole bunch of different ways in which the white racial frame manifests itself in comics and graphic novels in US history. Some of them are really overt and obvious, at least looking back on them. I think they were probably still pretty overt and obvious at the time, but they were seen as permissible. There are others that are much more subtle and political, as for instance, the constant demonization of independence movements in Latin American countries. There are still elements of sort of direct, obvious racism, but there's also, I would say on a deeper level, regardless of the way individual characters are being depicted, there's a general dismissal of the idea that people who aren't white are capable of making decisions for themselves or running their own societies. That concept is just foreign to the creators of these comics. And that actually dovetails with another of the major genres of American comics, which was the Western, which was one of the chapters that Joe was lead investigator on.
Yeah, and so this came into play after World War II. And the book is basically chronologically paced, although we tend to deal with sort of the bigwig comics creators, the Stan Lees of the world, the Robert Crumbs of the world. And so yeah, Westerns after World War II. What I found was that Westerns Western comics were kind of dominated by two archetypal figures. One was the sort of bandit gunslinger, who was often pitted against Native Americans, and Stan Lee's Rawhide Kid was a good example of that. Here, and that was in the 50s, here is an image from Jack Kirby and Joe Simon. Of course, Jack Kirby would later draw for Stan Lee, but Kid Cowboys of Boys Ranch. And this is the other archetypal figure, was the quote-unquote white Indian. And this was a character who either grew up or was somehow exposed to Native American culture, but still sort of maintained a certain amount of whiteness. And those two figures dominated the genre. Almost every Western comic that I read had one or more of those types of figures. So in the Kid Cowboys of Boys Ranch, there is a figure who's a white Indian type character, or a man who knows Indians, usually a very powerful figure. But in this early 1950s version of Jack Kirby, the character always sides with the white government against the Native Americans. With the years later, with the introduction to the character Jonah Hex, here was an example of a white Indian character who grew up with a Native American tribe, and then actually would often side against white people in the white government. So there was an evolution of that type of character. And the gunslinger bandit also oftentimes went through an evolution. For example, Rawhide Kid, which was Stan Lee's character, in the 50s was re-released in 2000s, and was an overtly gay character, so completely subverted that. But I want to get into a little bit more specifically about what I had about Westerns covering these two characters. After World War II, superheroes temporarily lost their position as the preeminent genre of American comics. One of the genres that filled the gap was the Western. Driven in large part by the myth of the frontier, the Western was a prominent feature of the American comic book marketplace from the 40s through the 60s. Integral to the myth of the frontier was the belief that progress was defined by the supremacy of pure-blooded whiteness over savagery. Perhaps the most prominent figure in the Western genre is the outlaw bandit and gunslinger. Although the gunslinger is a familiar figure to any consumer of American popular culture, most people do not know that its origin can be traced back to the repudiation of government-forced emancipation and Reconstruction after the Civil War. As the cultural historian Richard Slotkin relates, the myths of social banditry are symbolic dramatizations of social conflicts in the South. This kind of conflict arose from the Northern imposed Reconstruction of the former Confederacy, a complex of racial, political, and economic conflicts between freed slaves, poor whites, former masters, and new plantation owners. So this is saying that this American archetype of the bandit, gunslinger, outlaw is essentially had its origins as somebody who's going against Northern imposed Reconstruction. That sort of blew my mind, actually, when I realized that if you think about in our current political dialogue this notion of the outsider, of the bandit, this really has its roots, I think, in sort of Southern cultural racism and the idea of sort of the lost cause of slavery. A lesser-known Western archetype, but arguably one of equal importance, is the white Indian, a man who absorbs Indianness but does not assimilate into it. The white Indian occupies an ambivalent and liminal position on the margins of both white and Indian culture. While white Indians typically choose loyalty to white culture over their adopted Indian culture, there are important exceptions to this. To preserve the myth of monolithic whiteness, white supremacy, and the notion of blood purity, many states in the United States adopted the one-drop rule, whereby anyone with at least 1% of non-white blood was legally non-white and could not partake of privileges reserved for white people. The belief in blood purity drew a line between whites and Native Americans that was, at least in theory, uncrossable. However, for whites to survive on the frontier, this line had to be recrossed time and again. To resolve this contradiction, the figure of the white Indian, or the man who knows Indians, was created. And this notion of race having to do with blood purity really figures in a lot of the different comics, and really gets into this sort of intersectionalities of a lot of what goes into whiteness, including sexuality, gender, all those kinds of things. But and then as we move on to the 60s and 70s, which was Doug's Bailiwick.
Oh wait, this one is in your chapter though.
Oh yeah, that's a Jonah Hex, or no, not Jonah Hex, but Jack Jackson, who was a cultural historian, comics historian. His sort of bag was that he purported to write history books as comics. And he really had this notion of verisimilitude, where he would argue that this is really how it was from the point of view of the Southerners. And he wrote this comic about John Wesley Hardin, which was a famous outlaw gunslinger who was a perfect example of the type of gunslinger who was really going against the laws of Reconstruction. And what they were on the run from, what they were bandits from, was actually, like I said, Northern imposed laws banning slavery. And this would even include Jesse James and the train robbers. All those sort of what we know about gunslingers and folks robbing trains were oftentimes outlaws from the South and running against lawmen who were from the North. So really racist text throughout, and Jackson, in many essays, would argue that he was simply telling history from the point of view of white Southerners, which was laughable because it was totally egregious throughout the whole thing.
Yeah, so the Lost Cause graphic novel that is on the screen here was published in 1998, but this was kind of the culmination of work he'd been doing for a couple of decades. Mm-hmm. So we've now moved into the post-civil rights era, and also the post-Vietnam War era. And both the civil rights movement and the Vietnam War created a bit of a reckoning with race for the US comics industry. It was kind of short-lived. I would argue it was only partially successful, but it was a very interesting moment. And so, for instance, there were no black superheroes before the late 1960s. And as the civil rights movement pointed towards the enduring racial inequality of the United States, you started getting comic book companies that wanted to now introduce black characters. And that was certainly a step forward, although they struggled to create characters that would be, independent, and were actually capable of having any kind of sophisticated discourse on race, because the people creating these comics were still almost entirely white, and were themselves very conflicted and not really willing to acknowledge all of the ways that race and racism permeate American society. They wanted to not be racist, but they didn't really want to unpack American history or comics history. And so on the one hand, this led to a lot of pretty unsatisfying stories from the perspective of presenting any kind of coherent critique of racism in the United States, but they are absolutely fascinating as symptoms of their creators and of white America's in general inability to fully grapple with the history of race in America. Of wanting to move past it, but without really looking at what they were moving past. So I'm going to kind of exemplify this through one of these new black characters that was created, who was Falcon, who is still, a significant Marvel superhero today. He recently had his own TV series. He's appeared in a bunch of the Captain America movies. He begins as a sidekick of Captain America, who Captain America meets on this deserted island that he's been imprisoned on. And so, when it starts out, I mean, the black character he's not a superhero. He doesn't have superpowers. Captain America sort of teaches him how to be a superhero. It's a very kind of classic sort of coming of age story, except the black character who is supposed to be coming of age is already a fully grown man. And so immediately the sort of problems begin because he's being treated, it's perpetuating this earlier history of treating black characters as though they were children. Even though the whole point of introducing a black character is that he is supposed to be a hero, right? On some level, he's supposed to be the equal of Captain America, although Captain America at this point is still the one with his name on the book. Later, there's like 4 or 5 years where it's Captain America and Falcon, and they both appear on the cover on opposite sides. But at first, it's just Captain America. And, as the stories unfold, I mean, the character of the Falcon himself starts voicing to Captain America that he feels like he's being treated as a second-class member of the team. And you can, I mean, you're watching like the thought process of the white comic, the writers and artists thinking about this unfold. It's clear that they had not thought about this when they created the character. But as they started writing it and seeing their stories and also seeing the reaction from their fans, they start realizing, okay, wait, we're not doing this right. We've got to do this better. But they don't know what that looks like. And the letter columns in this period in these comics are fascinating because they're writing for, I mean, this was a Marvel character. Marvel's audience ranged, I would say, generally from 12 to 25 or so. So it was at like adolescent through post-college. And this was one of the things that Marvel was known for and distinguished them from DC is that they reached into the older age brackets. Now, and I mean, this is in the late 60s, and so they're writing for like a lot of their readers are high school and college students in the middle of the civil rights movement when these were burning issues on college campuses. And so their students are writing in to be like, this is still kind of racist, essentially. I mean, it's kind of you only get the fan's voice in the letter columns, but you can see the writer's response in the stories as they try to do better, but they kind of can't. They're stuck. So for instance, one of the recurring plot lines in the Falcon, Captain America stories was the two of them, they're very much situated in identifiably New York City at this time. They keep intervening in conflicts between civil rights protesters and police and other white authorities. And the two of them end up, I mean, at different times, they both end up on either side, with each other, against each other, with the protesters, against the protesters, with the authorities, against the authorities, and they're just constantly arguing over who is right and also over their own relationship. Because the Falcon frequently is saying, black people need to be treated equally, and I haven't been treated as an equal by you, and black people in New York City have not been treated as an equal by the leaders of the city. And it's also complicated by the fact that there are always supervillains involved, and the supervillains are often pulling the strings of different groups. And there's also a conflict. They're always trying to differentiate between the good protesters who are nonviolent and want to make change by sort of working within the system, with the bad radical protesters who are violent and need to be crushed. And so the Falcon, and both the Falcon and Captain America are torn between those two groups. The Falcon is more sympathetic with the more radical Black Power groups, Captain America less so, but the two of them also can't unstick themselves from each other because the whole basis of the story is that they're a team. But they can't agree, they're arguing in every issue, and whether they are in fact a team at any given time is one of the main ongoing plot threads. So, so here there's, on the left is an example of an evil black radical from the Falcon, who is using his organization to manipulate the black community for his own gain. And it's a pretty nasty stereotype. I mean, and and at the same time, there's good black protesters who are being misled by the evil black leader. So there's this constant attempt to sort of drive a wedge between the good and bad, quote, good and bad wings of the movement, and it's up to the characters to differentiate who is good and bad, although ultimately the one who's actually making the decision are the writers and artists who are almost entirely white. And also Jewish, which creates its own complication because Jews had a history of also being discriminated against, but they were provisionally white, so they were able to assimilate, but they also felt that they could empathize with other oppressed groups. And that's a long story as well. But on the right is another example of sort of an evil, bad, militant black leader who ends up being unmasked as Red Skull, who was the old Nazi supervillain from the World War II era. So there's an equation there. It's saying like this black radical, he's the real racist, he's actually a Nazi in disguise. And this is you could compare him, for instance, to the way that Malcolm X was described as being racist. And I mean, that's a trope that continues up into today, that, when black people unapologetically fight racism, they are pretty much guaranteed to be labeled as racists. Yeah, and so, there's a crisis of conscience in Captain America and the Falcon. Something similar happens in Iron Man. Iron Man is an arms manufacturer whose origin story is that he is captured while he's bringing like some newfangled weapon to Vietnam in the Vietnam War to help win the war and defeat the evil Vietnamese, with all kinds of callbacks to the anti-Asian stereotypes from World War II. And his origin is, he creates the Iron Man suit in order to escape from his evil Chinese captors. And the evil Asians have now switched back to being Chinese, since now China is communist and they're the evil group. But so in the 70s, as opposition to the Vietnam War intensifies, Tony Stark, the Iron Man character, begins questioning the whole foundation of his wealth and his character and his persona. He's like, maybe it's not so great to be an arms manufacturer. Maybe that's not a great calling. And he has a crisis of conscience. I mean, Captain America goes through a couple of these as well. And so this to me is one of the most interesting moments in American superhero history. It kind of gets recycled again in the 2000s. So like for any comics fans in the audience, the Civil War and Winter Soldier plot lines are drawing a lot from this period. But all of this kind of comes to a fairly abrupt end in 1975, 1976. The civil rights movement is in decline, the Vietnam War is over, and all of these storylines basically get retconned, which is a fan term that means retroactive continuity. It's when you change the prior history of a character and say, okay, that never happened. It's kind of a great term, retconned. So they retcon all of this pretty much out of existence. And so, the Falcon, for instance, had originally been a sort of social worker with like who was like had very liberal politics and wanted to like improve society. Around in 75 or 76, he gets retconned into being a reformed drug dealer, which kind of just gives you the flavor for the period, right? Of sort of, downplaying any kind of social concerns and just giving him a backstory as a criminal, which became sort of a justification for undoing the whole civil rights movement. It was crime. And that kind of takes us into the 80s. Oh, but so but again, so there's lots of terrible writing and ideas about race in here. But on the other hand, this is also the period when Black Panther gets created. And Black Panther, I would say, he's basically just, you take the Jungle Queen, the Sheena Jungle Queen character, and you just invert everything. Instead of a white savior who has to protect the childlike black people with her more advanced white civilization, in fact, the Black Panther is the king of a hidden, unknown, super technologically advanced black kingdom in the center of Africa, the heart of Africa, or the Heart of Darkness in the famous novel by Joseph Conrad. The Heart of Darkness now gets turned inside out, and it becomes, and this was done by a white Jewish cartoonist who had his own history of very questionable racial depictions. But I mean, the Black Panther, I would say, was kind of a stroke of genius where he actually is more or less able to transcend his own sort of limitations of his own racial awareness. Although at the same time, I mean, he doesn't completely give it up. I mean, if you look in the bottom two panels here, there still is this sort of cheering crowd of savagey looking black people and this giant totem that they're worshiping, but he sort of has flipped it and now they're the heroes instead of the villains. You could have a pretty interesting analysis of how completely he moved beyond the sort of primitivist trope of the uncivilized black people. But I mean, the Black Panther, I mean, I think as an icon of black power, it's very successful. I mean, it's been taken up by lots of black cultural creators. It's been cited as an influence by lots of people who went on to become activists and advocates for racial equality. So I think just on the level of, it created a totally different paradigm, and I think it was very successful in just, creating this icon. Okay, and so that kind of now brings us into the 1980s and back to Watchmen, which was sort of the genesis of this whole book project for Joe. And so this was, this chapter is in the second half of the book, but it was the first one that was written since this was the conference presentation that started the whole project.
Funny anecdote too is, I think when we very first started, I had finished my Watchmen chapter, and we needed 2 chapters to get the book contract. And I think Doug thought I was breathing down his neck, and he's like, "Man, you started this before me. You can't rush me on this," but which was kind of funny. But anyway, the 80s marked a moment for comics that really sort of put them on the literary map, I would say. Watchmen was certainly part of that. Also, Frank Miller's The Dark Knight Returns was part of that. And also, Art Spiegelman's Mouse all came out in the 80s and really got people thinking about comics as literature. And I'm pretty sure the whole idea of the term graphic novel came out at this point too. Isn't that so, Doug?
Yep.
Yeah. Watchmen is, as a graphic novel or as a piece of literature, it's often included in the 100 best books of all time. It's really elevated the art form. It's really elevated the genre. And what struck me about it when I first read it in 2012 was that a lot of the superheroes were racist, homophobic, misogynistic, and yet they all were sort of hiding their own insecurities and sort of purporting to be white. And I started thinking, well, that's an interesting definition for whiteness. We know that it's provisional. We know that it changes. We know that it's mutable. We know it's not grounded in biology. And so I started thinking that, whiteness, it seems like for these characters, is a sort of denial of any kind of internal fragmentation. And I was really drawn to the theorists W.B. Du Bois and Gloria Anzaldúa because they talk about non-whiteness as exactly that. Du Bois talks about non-whiteness being a sort of multi-consciousness, double consciousness, that one is constantly thinking of oneself as both black and America, and sometimes are at odds with one another. And Gloria Anzaldúa talks about being Latinx in America as being on a sort of borderland. And she's always also refers to that as being non-normative sexualities as existing on a borderland as well. So then if non-whiteness was about borderlands, was about multi-consciousness, then whiteness was this notion of denial of any kind of internal fragmentation, this myth of monolithic race. And that really kind of set me on fire a little bit in terms of a kind of a framing concept. And so that's really what I started to write about with respect to Watchmen. So I'll share a little bit about that. Arguably the greatest superhero comic of all time, Alan Moore's Watchmen reinvigorated the superhero genre by employing postmodern techniques such as deconstruction and metafiction to defamiliarize the tropes of the white superhero and expose them as a fraudulent construction of heteronormative whiteness. Historically, superhero comics have validated discourses of power by presenting white heterosexual men who defend a white heteronormative culture from villainous agents of change and disruption. In Watchmen, Moore deconstructs the superheroes, perpetuating and defending a fraudulent version of whiteness predicated on masking splintered consciousness and sexual borderlands, both of which constitute monolithic whiteness. Moore draws attention to the mechanisms by which superheroes are constructed, to wit, by masking their fragmented consciousness and sexual borderlands. In doing so, he exposes whiteness as the prevailing social barometer that superheroes employ and require to mete out justice, and thereby freshened a genre that had grown somewhat stale. I taught a class one time called The Death of the Superhero and used Watchmen quite a bit. Moore is interested in suggesting that superheroes couldn't really exist in real life. Hooded Justice, the first documented superhero in Watchmen's fictional world, represents a construct of white male heteronormativity that functions as a closet, masking what W.B. Du Bois calls a fragmented or double consciousness, and Gloria Anzaldúa describes as an internal borderland. Both theorists identify internal identity fragmentation, the idea of an individual identifying with multiple social groups and categories, as a characteristic of marginalization. We would take these theories one step further and suggest that identity fragmentation is actually the normative social state of being for a preponderance of Americans, if not all human beings. In drawing attention to the hidden borderlands of identity, both Du Bois and Anzaldúa align with queer theorists such as Eve Kosofsky-Sedgwick, who highlight the closet, which can pertain to any hidden identity, as a result of both individuals and society as a whole dichotomizing sexual identity. The obvious messiness of sexual desire notwithstanding, the human species, quote, has come more and more to be divided between homosexual and heterosexual, just as it is often divided between white and non-white. Consequently, we can view sexuality and race on a macro level as marked by a cultural closet inhabited by people masking splintered internal identities to fit into constructed sexual and racial binaries. Hooded Justice, political whiteness, denies his fragmented consciousness and internal borderland. Both Du Bois and Anzaldúa identify the source of their fragmented consciousness in the heteronormative white gaze. For the superheroes and Watchmen, hiding their broken consciousness is part of the foundation of their whiteness. Passing the baton to you, my man.
Yeah, so most of the title of the book was Bandits, Misfits, and Superheroes, Whiteness and Its Borderlands in American Comics and Graphic Novels. And by this point, you should be kind of getting a sense of the overall trajectory of the argument. We've gone a little over time, so I'm going to shorten this next section a little bit. We spent a lot of time looking at superheroes, but we're not exclusively limited to superheroes. And one book that I talked about in one of the later chapters was called Jimmy Corrigan, the Smartest Kid on Earth, which is written by a writer slash artist who was definitely not like a typical mainstream superhero cartoonist. I mean, mostly he wrote very kind of complicated stories about the everyday lives of characters struggling with depression and loneliness. I would say that's his kind of overall theme. But in this particular story, superheroes make a kind of recurring cameo role as in the fictional imagination of the primary character, Jimmy Corrigan. And Jimmy his story is that his father left him and his mother when he was very young, and that was very traumatic for him. He never fully recovered from it. And there's when he's very young, he sees an actor portraying a Superman-like character who he develops who becomes a sort of fictional alternative father for him. But he, so when he's feeling lonely, he sort of imagines this superhero, but it's never really clear what he's imagining. So for instance, on the right, and it's also formatted not like a normal comic, an image on the right shows a character wearing a superhero costume jumping off of a building across from Jimmy's office. And the character lands on the ground. And it's completely not clear in the story whether Jimmy is imagining this. And it's sort of the idea of Superman jumping off of a tall building or leaping over a tall building. But in this case, he doesn't leap over it. He just falls off of it and dies. But it's unclear if this really happened or if Jimmy just imagined this. It's also unclear if this is supposed to be Jimmy. Is he imagining himself committing suicide? Is this possibly showing his actual suicide? Because the novel is not in chronological order. It jumps forwards and backwards. So, this is, I'm including this here because it's an example of the way that somebody who's coming, a cartoonist is looking at the superhero genre from outside of the genre and dealing with themes of strength and power and autonomy that are central to the superhero genre from a very different kind of angle. And what this has to do with Whiteness is that the main kind of story arc of this story is that Jimmy is able to locate his father, who is living in a different city and has a new family. And Jimmy takes a trip to go meet him. This page is showing him imagining his father. All different, he's never met him. He's exchanged a couple brief letters with him. He doesn't know what to expect, and this is him fantasizing different versions of it. It turns out that his father has a new family, including an adopted daughter who is black, who he is actually very close to. His dad is kind of a jerk, no doubt, and his daughter is quite nice. But the two of them, despite the fact that the father is still kind of a jerk and the daughter kind of knows it, they still have a close relationship. So it's a very sort of touching portrait of a complicated family relationship. It's really sort of beautifully drawn. And you can see here the two of them are looking at old family photos of Jimmy's stepsister, of her with the father who he does not have any family photos with because this man has just been in absence in his entire life, and he's wearing his Superman shirt. And again, Superman for Jimmy is this sort of alter ego that makes him feel powerful, except it totally doesn't work because Jimmy never feels powerful. Within the context of this story, Superman is this completely failed attempt by Jimmy to assert some sort of self-control or agency over his own life. And again, the fact that his stepsister, she had the father that he always wanted and never had. The fact that she's black is actually never really commented on. It's like a lot of things in this story, Chris Ware just drops it in and lets the audience draw their own conclusion or no conclusion from it. But I think he is clearly aware that black characters had traditionally been excluded from the superhero genre. And this is a very unconventional kind of superhero story. There are no superheroes here. There's a whole other second story that takes place at the turn of the 20th century with Jimmy's grandfather and great-grandfather that parallels this story, that also involves some very interesting and complicated narratives with black characters, which I'm not even going to attempt to summarize. But so again, just the reason I'm including this is that it's an example of a very different way of approaching the twinned topics of race and superheroes. And that, I think, I mean, I guess I'm just going to say, I mean, there's been some progress on this in the 21st century. There have been a number of really interesting storylines that have come out from Marvel and DC that have started to really sort of reimagine the way that race is portrayed in comic books and the superhero genre. And a lot of these started in comic book form, but then sort of have gotten adapted in some form into movies. And at this point, I mean, the comic book industry has become just sort of like a feeder assembly line for the Marvel Cinematic Universe, which has just completely eaten the Marvel comic book company, economically speaking. So these are two, I would say, of the standouts. Sorry, Joe, I'm kind of just, I'm trying to leave some time for discussion here.
Oh, that's all right.
Yeah, but Truth, which reimagines Captain America's origin story with a black character, and Miss Marvel, which reimagines that character as a Pakistani American.
Well, I want to leave you all just with our central conclusions of the book, some of which are in the conclusion. We might think of the history of American comics as graphic novels as a genealogy of false heroes. While putting forward an endless succession of putative heroes in brightly colored costumes, American comics have often catered to white men's basest desires, instincts, and fears of progressivism and multiculturalism by simultaneously villainizing difference and exulting in heteronormative whiteness. Oftentimes, comic book creators have sought to undo white supremacy only to further reinforce it as a result of their unexamined racial biases and framing. American comics and graphic novels symbolize ideological cultural dreamscapes where far too often what appears on the page is sublimated white supremacy. While one can trace Superman's powers to the sun, Green Lantern's to his cosmic ring, and Captain America's to the super soldier serum, that of whiteness can be traced to structural racism and its power of invisibility. Its origin story lies in its self-designation as the state of normality, contrary to non-whiteness, which has been rendered supposedly abnormal. While non-whites were racialized, whites themselves, even as their ranks changed and absorbed, formerly racialized folks like the Irish and Italians were considered raceless, their ethnicity a lacuna, a blind spot, a lack. Consequently, the existence of the power structure driven by white supremacy, which has been responsible for so much destruction and dehumanization, has generally been denied by its very perpetrators and left to operate unbeknownst to those who benefit most from it. Our central conclusion in this book is that comic books have existed for most, if not all, of their history as an instantiation of white supremacy, and the power of invisibility by which whiteness operates has rendered its cultural agents mostly unaware of their own complicity in its operation. In this book, we hope that we have made visible what has been invisible, even to the cultural producers themselves, and especially to the millions of fans of comics and their cultural permutations. We hope that we have demonstrated that whiteness exists as a destructive cultural and political force in America that can be identified and analyzed within our most powerful cultural artifacts, with the hope that if we can see it, then we can destroy it. And maybe it goes without saying, but we would like to note that in addition to being academics, we are also fans of comics. As academics who analyze cultural artifacts, we often find ourselves interrogating and scrutinizing what we love, often with disappointing results. Perhaps we do this because we love the artifacts so much and see their progressive potential. Nevertheless, we hope that in this book we are able to convince readers that comics have been carriers of white supremacy for nearly a century, and we agree with G.I. Joe that knowing is half the battle.
A few questions. If anyone in the audience has them, I'm happy to come around with the mic and let you ask them. Thank you. Thank both of you for that talk. I think you gave us so much to think about. Anyone? Yeah.
So for both of you, what was your greatest takeaway professionally and personally from this experience?
Well, one answer for me, and this is maybe kind of superficial, but Joe had already written 2 books, and it's written like, I don't know, 2 more since then or something like that. I mean, his productivity is ridiculous. I'm much slower, and I'd never written a book, so I kind of piggybacked on his ability to just like lay out a book. I mean, I learned a lot when I was doing this. I learned a lot about comics history. I learned a lot about the history of race in the United States. You know, I mean, and you know, I think, you know, we became and have remained good friends. So, I mean, I would say all of that.
Yeah, you know, working with somebody who you respect a great deal and like, not unlike a lot of relationships, is both rewarding and incredibly frustrating, right? So we couldn't blow each other's off. You know, we couldn't blow off our comments. We had to take them seriously. And I think that my own flaws emerged and became kind of apparent to me through Doug's strengths. And so I think that that's probably, I mean, working with Doug made me a better writer, you know, flat out, and a better researcher. And so I think that I mean, both on a personal level and a professional level, that was probably the most valuable thing for me.
Thank you. Any other questions? I kind of have one, which is I am not familiar with comics. I'm not even in the Marvel universe, mostly. It sounds like perhaps at the end you were kind of suggesting that there could be a hopeful trajectory for comics. I don't know if you can. I was curious, though, to think about this paradigm in a way that it seems almost like there's you're also suggesting that there's this unconscious bias that's happening in a lot of these comics. Could it be possible that just that, in that way, when you have a critique of, say, I'm trying to remember the Falcon, right? When you have a critique by the audience saying this is not a representation that we like, and then there's a little bit of a gesture towards it, if that itself is kind of a safety valve that maybe isn't even just unconscious, right? But that is perhaps maintaining a status quo intentionally. I don't know if you have any thoughts on that, or sounds like you're seeing a hopeful trajectory in the long run, but I don't know, it's just kind of curious to see this pattern over and over. Is it just enough of letting out the steam that you don't have to go deeper at that moment? I don't know.
Well, I mean, I don't think there's any hope that we're going to resolve that question here, because that goes way beyond the scope of comics. I mean, that's a recurrent argument among academics and among like activists so, I mean, you know, there was a book that came out like a decade ago called The New Jim Crow that argued that the prison industrial complex essentially functioned as a replacement system for Jim Crow, another way of maintaining white supremacy, and that Jim Crow was in turn functioning as a replacement for outright slavery. And so the idea is that when one form of racial oppression is, you know, attacked and criticized and ultimately dismantled, some other form is, you know, there's a gap period where actually a lot of progress gets made, but then some sort of replacement system gets imposed. And the replacement is less explicit than the original version, which also makes it harder to identify and attack. And so, I mean, there's been a debate over whether that is actually progress or not. And so, for instance, like the writer Ta-Nehisi Coates, I mean, he's made a lot of major contributions to like political discourse, but one of his arguments is that, I mean, and I don't know if he still fully holds to this, but his argument was that Jim Crow and the prison industrial complex have not been improvements. And that that progress has not been made since before the Civil War. It's just changed form. But there's other people who say, yeah, you know, who acknowledge that racism and white supremacy still exist, but that there nevertheless has been progress. And so, I mean, who is right? I mean, I guess I tend to think that there has been some progress, but it also definitely is very easy to think that there has been more progress than there actually has. And so, when Obama got elected, people all over were declaring that this means that there's no more racism in America because we elected a black president, as though that undid all of the systems of racial oppression that existed, which was an idea that kind of clearly became ridiculous relatively shortly thereafter. But I do think that the fact that we did have a black president is a pretty significant advance over where we were before emancipation.
I think comics are strange in that it's such a pop cultural medium that they really do reflect the climate of our cultural politics and always have. So the answer to whether or not we see comics optimistically, the answer to that is, do we see our culture optimistically? And those are the same answers, And it depends. Boy, right now, I don't have, I'm on a downswing of perspective, but yeah, and that's one thing that struck me too, is that comics, as much as any genre, really was a reflection of the culture, for better or for worse, and usually for worse.
And incidentally, Ta-Nehisi Coates had a run as the writer of Black Panther a couple years ago, where his take on Black Panther, and I think this was after the movie came out, right? So, the Black Panther had become a massive cultural icon of blackness, and Ta-Nehisi Coates, he's one of sort of the leading contemporary black intellectuals in the country. What he did with the series was he imagined how Black Panther would function as the ruler of Wakanda, his fictional kingdom and homeland. And what happens is that it's not heroic, and he gets pulled into a bunch of kind of intractable conflicts that he can't solve. So he used it to illustrate his idea that there is no quick and easy solution to racial oppression, and that in fact I don't know if you would say it's a completely intractable problem, but it's a very, very hard problem. And this is despite the fact that one of the other things he's best known for is advocating for reparations for slavery. And he was that was an idea that had been circulating for decades, but he's the one who is mostly responsible for bringing it into mainstream political discussions. So clearly he also doesn't think that it's all just hopeless, or why even bother advocating for that, right?
He recently got a run writing for Captain America, which was its own signal of progress, too. A black writer writing Captain America stories, right? So there is that progress built in, I think.
Do we have any other questions? Yeah.
I'm just curious if there was any black people that contributed to the comics, because like you said, there was white people writing about black people and they didn't know how to represent black people well. My question is, why not just hire black writers and black illustrators? It just seems a bit hypocritical to give them a voice on a piece of paper but not in real life.
Yes.
Yeah.
And that critique did not land for decades. You started hearing those critiques coming from fans and from black creators and other creators of color in the 90s. And I would say really the book on the left, Truth, the writer and artist are both people of color. I would say that graphic novel really cracked open the discourse, but that critique really, in the 70s, it was mostly like white people talking to other white people about black and brown people, because there were so few black and brown people in the industry. It's like single digits. You can count them on one or maybe two hands. And it's gotten a lot, there has been progress there in the last 20 years, but it is also very clearly still not enough.
And that's one reason why the attempts to address race in comics were almost ridiculous, that they were counterproductive completely in many cases. I know we're after time.
Yeah. We're after time. So again, remember that there is a reception over in the Fine Arts Gallery. I want to thank you both again for this talk and for giving us an opportunity to, at least me, to think about some of these comics that I've never thought about. And hopefully we can continue the discussion over at the reception.
Cool, thank you. I had no idea we'd gone down that long.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No,
How long did
well,
we
I
go?
started, when I checked it was